Welcome back to the Historian's Craft, guys. So in this video, if you can't tell based on the title, we're talking about a couple interrelated things. Late Roman aristocrats, which we've covered before, but we're going to do so now in a slightly different light. The late Roman governmental bureaucracy, bureaucratic titles, ranks, that kind of thing, and how and why this came to be, and maybe more importantly, how and why these people, the aristocrats and the bureaucrats, were central to the longevity of the late Roman state and why they are partly responsible for the way it broke up. So, with that said, to a degree, the popular, not the academic, but the popular, the stuff you see maybe in like podcasts, accepting Patrick Wyman's The Fall of Rome, because he's actually a trained late Roman historian, but maybe something you see in like non-specialist design podcasts, textbooks, definitely older documentaries, is that the late Roman Empire was a top-heavy, overly bureaucratic state, okay, whose inefficiencies ultimately played a major role in its downfall. And you see this definitely in like older literature as well. Now what I want to do in this video is briefly, like I said, talk about those bureaucrats and their role in maintaining the empire as a functioning state, because it actually goes way beyond governmental duties and it becomes closely entwined with the barbarians and the creation of post-Roman successor kingdoms, like the Merovingians, like the Visigoths, etc. So before I do that then, I need to briefly just mention one major historian, because this is where this whole idea of, well, not the entire thing, but this is where definitely a significant chunk of this whole idea of the late Roman Empire being this, monolithic, slow-moving state. This is where a lot of it comes from, and it comes from this late Roman historian, this British guy named Jones. Here comes the cat. Suppose it's appropriate Octavia's in here for a Roman video. Anyway, Arnold Hugh Martin Jones was one of the main figures working on the late Roman Empire before Peter Brown shows up. You're going to do this the whole time, aren't you? So, like I was saying before the cat intruded, Jones was one of the main figures working on the late Roman Empire before Peter Brown shows up in the 1970s and largely creates late antiquity as we know this field today. So Jones is known for writing this massive 1,000-page, here we go again. So Jones is known for writing this massive 1,100 and change page study with about 200 pages of footnotes called The Later Roman Empire 284 to 604, A Social and Economic History. It is a massive book, and this is very much the traditional or the conservative way of viewing the late Roman Empire, and by traditional or conservative what I mean here is the sense that it contrasts with the late antique view of dynamism and change espoused by Peter Brown and people that follow in that line of thought. So Jones understood the empire to be a massive, slow-moving beast, which, in theory, and this still crops up today, in theory, it was an authoritarian one-party state centered around the person of the imperial emperor, the imperial family, and then all around him, okay, are the bureaucrats, the aristocrats, etc. At least in theory, that's how this thing operated to Jones and people that agree with that interpretation. But based on a lot of research, since this was published in like the 60s, we know that it's not quite the case. It differs in actual practice, as things often do. So, to reiterate then, the traditional way of viewing this is that this great monstrosity, the slow-moving beast that we call the Roman Empire, is based around the emperor, the imperial family, and he's allied with the Roman aristocracy. Okay, well, who are those people? And the traditional answer is that the aristocrats are these great landholders. They hold massive amounts of land, and they hold peasants to them in, bondage. Maybe not quite like medieval serfdom, but maybe something like it. The Roman term is colony. We'll talk about that in a dedicated video. But it's basically a tenant-renter type relationship, oftentimes. Not always, but oftentimes that's what it looks like, especially in Gaul. So the government exercises control and censorship over the state because it has groups of men in place, like the governors and the agentes and rebus, the agents in affairs, who have sometimes been viewed as a late imperial version of the frumentarii, the scouts, and they kind of function to a degree as something like a secret police. I've done a short video on them, but they're not quite the equivalent, okay, of the Gestapo, the Stasi, the Tokubetsu Koto, the Japanese Imperial Thought Police. Nothing like that. But they do try to keep an eye on things. And since the 80s, this whole idea has been challenged relatively successfully. Okay, we now realize the late Roman Empire, while it was a slow-moving entity, it was not at all like the dictatorial regimes of Hitler's Germany, of Stalin's Russia, maybe of Mao's China, etc. And the emperors, although in theory they have absolute power, they don't really, not in practice. They have to work with the aristocracy and the bureaucracy. And the members of those groups, okay, often have very specific demands and very specific needs they're trying to get out of the empire, which mark them out from the manner in which they operated in the early Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries. So that empire, the early empire, it governed with maybe a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people, but the late Roman Empire governed with a bureaucracy of anywhere between 25 and 35, maybe 40,000 people. So then we have to ask, okay, the early empire has a couple hundred, maybe 2,000 people. The late Roman Empire, 25, 30, 35, 40,000 people. That's a huge difference. So how do we account for this, and where do these people come from, and what do they want? Well, the Roman Empire, and I'll probably throw up a map here or here, somewhere in the video, to paraphrase Peter Brown's words in The World of Late Antiquity, it expands initially to try to bring together the Mediterranean littoral, basically what we consider to be like classical civilization, right? Greece, Rome, Egypt, some states in the Near East. Now, the debate over Roman imperialism, that is, what the Romans were doing in the construction of their empire, has largely taken two different angles. Argument number one: Rome expanded with offensive action in mind. Argument number two is that Rome expanded with defensive and preventive action in mind. The general consensus is that it was probably both at different times, but either way, ultimately what the Romans were seeking, okay, is a fairly stable frontier. And in the process of establishing that frontier, Roman civilization expands outside of that Mediterranean littoral. It goes into Spain, it goes into Gaul, it goes into Britain, it goes into chunks of North Africa that maybe were not considered part of classical civilization, and they have to deal, okay, with non-classical peoples, by which I mean the barbarians, the Celts, Germans, Moors, etc. And it expands into an area which no empire after Rome has really ever been able to hold together for any meaningfully long period of time. So, how did the Romans actually manage to do that? Well, in the early empire, the 1st and 2nd centuries, and even before that, during the last century of the Roman Republic, when Caesar's running around in Gaul, right, that time period, Rome absorbs what we understand today to basically be like Western Europe. And it's helped along in this by the fact that those cultures, not all of them, but many of them, especially in Gaul, a lot of these cultures are already present in Spain and Gaul, maybe a little bit in Britain, but I don't know, so don't take my word on that. But many of these cultures had been worked into the Roman economic system for a little while now, maybe a century, maybe two, and by the fact that there was something of a pre-Roman urban presence, especially in Gaul. So the Roman conquest, it was a bloody and it was a traumatizing affair for everybody involved, but the important thing is that after all the bloodshed, after Rome actually conquered the regions, the elites of these areas, Spain, Gaul, Britain, found it beneficial to integrate themselves into the Roman power structure. So then towns and cities, okay, they compete with each other to be granted different rights and privileges in the Roman system. So what are these rights and privileges? Well, money, political prestige, maybe the grant of citizenship, which would have been a huge boon to a lot of people because it means you get certain political rights, maybe lower taxes, but these towns and cities compete with each other. And the way in which they compete with each other is centered around the persons of local elites. So these guys, the local aristocracy, they spend a ton of money and other resources mobilizing the local populations and felling forests, mining ore, chiseling stone, dressing stone, dragging it into the city, mixing concrete, mixing mortar, mixing cement, and they are constructing public works out of their own pockets. They're building bathhouses, amphitheaters, temples, you name it, it was probably built at one point. Potentially even city walls, which we'll talk about in a separate video. But the towns, my point, okay, is that they literally build themselves into the Roman political and social system. Eventually, though, you run into a problem. You conquer Gaul, you conquer Spain, you conquer North Africa, etc. You have a certain number of aristocrats, you have a certain number of towns. Maybe some new places were founded. Okay, we know the Romans founded tons of colonies everywhere, but eventually, I mean, the space of a town, the space of a city is only so large. You can only build so many bathhouses, you can only build so many temples, you can only build so many amphitheaters, and you can only repave the road system so many times until the point where it becomes redundant. And although it's enriching for the local aristocracy and it grants them prestige, eventually there's not much left to do. So then, what do you do then? Eventually, not right away, but eventually, okay? And I'll throw another map up here, although you probably have all seen this at this point on the channel. Political assassinations and the economic reality that local regions begin producing their own goods, and the lack of a need for public, for a public face for the aristocracy, the lack of a need for public building, that is, leads to a breakup of the Roman Empire in a three-pronged civil war that we call the crisis of the 3rd century. Well, eventually, under the emperors Claudius, Aurelian, and Diocletian, the Roman Empire is reunited. But now they have another problem, okay? Now it's been demonstrated the empire has become too complex, too big, too large for the emperor and a few hundred people to actually govern. Now, in the 300s and in the 400s, towards the end of the Western Roman Empire, what we consider to be the late period, the city remains the most important center, the most important facet of Roman life, and the basic building block of Roman civilization, but the key structural reforms were taking place higher up in the ranks amongst the aristocracy. So the breaking of the empire into the tetrarchy under Diocletian, what it does is it reshapes power structures. Eventually, we have 114 provinces established across the empire, which are then grouped into dioceses, which are then grouped into praetorian prefectures. These areas, they'll see certain cities like Trier and Milan rise in importance, while other formerly great cities and towns decline in importance. So they're not close enough to the frontier, maybe trade routes bypass them, maybe the imperial presence is somewhere else, but eventually, education becomes increasingly important in this new world, and increasingly, what it does is in the reconstituted power structures of the late Roman Empire, it sucks up what we would understand to be, even though they didn't use this term, it sucks up what we would understand to be like the lower middle class and the upper poor into the low levels of the bureaucracy. Basically, you get a civil service job. Maybe you're a clerk, maybe you're a notary, something like that. So those positions start opening up more and more and more, and it's because the Roman Empire needs a bureaucracy to really govern a state this big. So in the late Empire, some public building did continue. If you read books, or maybe not books, rather polemic would be a better word, like Brian Ward Perkins' The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, which we've talked about before on this channel, you might come away with the idea that public building basically stopped after the 3rd century, and that's not wrong. It's just not a complete idea, because public building does continue, it's just drastically reduced in scale. And in the late Empire, going along with this change, the imperial family refocuses its efforts from the aristocracy, although they're still important, from the aristocracy to the bureaucracy, and increasingly the two become conflated. So lower level imperial offices bring people into the low ranks of the bureaucracy, who could then potentially move up to a low aristocratic position in Roman society. Although, let me be clear here, the old money never really considers the old money to be the same as them, so the civil service becomes the means by which one becomes socially mobile in the late Roman Empire. Now, in the early empire, there had been 2 aristocratic rankings, the senatorial and the equestrian ranks. Under Constantine, a 3rd was added, so now there's 3, and this is the comitiva. Those who were considered the companions of the emperor, people who worked their way up through the bureaucracy, and now they have the good life. Under the late empire, the equestrians become divided and subdivided into new ranks, all of which confer different social levels of social prestige based on which rank you have. So these are the egregi, the outstanding, the perfectissimi, the most perfect, and the eminentissimi, the most eminent. The comitiva were divided also into 3 separate ranks, but it's more complex than that, okay? Because you gained or you lost prestige based on whether an honoratus, one who held honor, had the prereqs for the title, or whether they were just conferred as an honorary title. So did you do the work? Did you hold the office? Or were you just given this thing? Kind of how, like, Elon Musk has an honorary PhD, but didn't actually go through the coursework, but he still has one. That kind of thing. It's a similar situation. Now, gradually, as the 300s move on and we get into the 400s, the equestrians and the comitiva recede, and eventually they disappear. Because the equestrians, what happens is, well, they're granted more and more honor and more titles, and a select few of them elevate into the senatorial class, and what's left is just goes away as the Western Empire begins to break up. So the senatorial order then expands, so much so that the late Roman government has to construct new titles for all of them. The spectabiles, the illustrious, and the gloriosi. So the glorious, the respectables, the illustrious, okay? And what this then allows the aristocracy to do was to be reintegrated into the imperial system, while at the same time allowing them to use their influence through letters of introduction, things of that nature, to basically put their supporters. So here we see the old patron-client system of the Republican and early imperial system doesn't go away. Doesn't really ever go away. It just changes. It lets these upper-ranking aristocrats use letters of introduction, stuff like that. So, who you know, not what you know, that kind of deal. It gets their people into these lower-ranking positions in the bureaucracy from which they can work their way up, and they owe their patrons loyalty. So this changes the aristocrats, who still relied on status, they still rely on their old money, into a system of aristocracy where prestige also depends upon civil service rank. So that idea that your prestige depends on your rank in the service, this combined with the movement of capitals and those resources out to the frontiers, and thus that benefits them in ways the early empire doesn't, so it becomes a system where by the 400s, the aristocrats were more interested, in what the system could do for them, rather than what they could do for the system. So what that means is that when the empire begins breaking up in the 400s, when the Franks and the Visigoths and others come in and they establish these, initially like client kingdoms, and then they break away and they're independent, kind of, but like not really, then they're fully independent, well, there's more local power structures in the immediate vicinity of all these aristocrats. So the reason the aristocrats attach themselves to these groups is because they offer on the local level what the imperial system offers in faraway Milan, Trier, Rome, Constantinople, etc. So my point, then, at the end of this spiel, is that the late Roman aristocracy and the late Roman bureaucracy are crucial to the integrity of the empire, and they're crucial to understanding the breakup, because they're trying to get what they want out of the system. But when what they want is offered closer to home, eventually, the empire as this big idea stops holding any meaning for them. And yes, you can make the argument that with the overthrow of Romulus Augustulus in 476, or maybe the death of Julius Nepos in 480, 481, yeah, maybe politically the Roman Empire breaks up, but there's also another dimension we have to take here, which is the social and aristocratic one. So that's it for this video, guys. Take care, the cat says hello, and I will see you all next time.